Hey viewers and viewers, my name is General Red Strategist and welcome back to some more So You're Being Hunted. It's just me though for this one, no Phil or Connor, because it's actually a weekday as we're recording, they're probably at work, so unfortunately that's not going to work for them. But, I just thought, fuck it, I was looking at my recording schedule because it was actually running down a little bit and I really need to record another episode of Sir, otherwise, I'd be recording some other game and there'd be a bit of a delay before the next Sir episode and all that. Because the thing is, last couple of weeks, ladies and gentlemen, I was off back up north in the north of England on holiday, visiting friends and family. I'm still technically on leave from work at the moment, hence why I'm doing recordings on a weekday during the day and all that. It's about midday actually as I want to record this. Obviously, by the time this video goes out, it'll probably be about 3 or 4 days after, something like that. But so first episode I'm recording after I basically get back to my apartment. And the thing is, I've still got another couple of weeks before the new term starts at work and all that. So, whilst there's a few little errands that I'll be running over the coming days, work-related stuff, I'm still very much, going to take some time to relax and hopefully, get cracking on with more recordings and all that. So that's, going to be obviously a bit of Sir. It's going to be some more of, obviously, If My Heart Had Wings, because I need to crack on with a bit more of that visual novel, especially since I'm probably not terribly far off the sort of climax of that game, I would imagine. I would assume, anyway. I don't know. Maybe, maybe not. Because, I don't know, I searched online, with like sites like How Long to Beat. I searched How Long to Beat, If My Heart Had Wings, and generally people say that, you can sort of get that game done in about 20 to 22 hours, something like that. And if you think about the number of episodes I've done on that so far, we can't be too far off if 20 to 22 hours is about the average, something like that. So, yeah, I want to crack on with that. Probably do nice big sizable episodes like I've been doing as usual. An hour, potentially more, maybe up to about an hour and a half, even as high as that. Granted, of course, I need to set aside plenty of time to do that recording and all, but yeah. Right, well, putting that aside, obviously we're going to have a nice substantive episode of Sir Being Hunted today, ladies and gentlemen. Going to be recording for anywhere up to an hour, I think, so, as promised quite a few weeks ago now, when I said I was going to change up the format, so we're going to go for something big. Nice big podcast style episode. So, have this on in the background as you're doing your housework or whatever, you're doing your chores. It's a bit like having a radio show on in the background, ladies and gentlemen. Saffron Dreading welcomes you. What a lovely little hamlet we've just wandered into. But, so obviously the fact that I was recently back up in the north of England, I could talk about things obviously I was doing while I was up there, and I'm not going to talk about everything that I did while I was back up north, because I'm thinking I might wait. Well, I'll talk about some of it, but most of it I'm going to wait until actually I get a recording session with Phil, because me and him actually did do something interesting. We got into Phil's car and we took a day up in the Lake District, and we did do a couple of good things. Visited Windermere, and then we went to the Lakeland Motor Museum. But like I say, I'm not going to talk about those because actually it'd be better to have him in the episode to talk about them. So that might be, who knows, the next episode of Sir in about a week or two, something like that, where we get an opportunity at a weekend just to sit down and chat about it and all that. But I did other stuff, apart from that while I was back up north. Namely, technically I had 2 Lake District visits while I was back up north, obviously the one with Phil, but then me and the old folks decided to take a drive up to Holker Hall. So if you don't know what Holker Hall is, it's a big old stately home, sort of in the South Lake District. I think it's not too far from Ulverston, and it's well worth a day out, You go there, you pay admission, you can go and wander around the gardens of it, because, it being a stately home, it's on a big estate and all that. I don't actually know too much about the history of it. I probably should have Googled that before I started recording this episode, in all honesty. But, so the thing is, obviously, there's the mansion itself, and, one of the tickets you can buy as part of your admission does actually allow you to go into the house, if you want to, have a look around. We didn't do that, we just bought the admission to go and look around the gardens. But that's always an option, if you're ever visiting the South Lakes and you want to go somewhere historical, Holker, ladies and gentlemen. I did take a few videos of the gardens on my phone, so if I remember to do so, this is something I always say very often and I always forget to actually do it, but if I remember to do so I'll try and see if I can transfer my video clips off my phone to my computer, email them to myself or whatever. I don't know if necessarily I'll put all of them in, but I'll put some of them in, maybe a little selection of highlights, just to give you a sense of what there is there, because the gardens are quite nice. They're very well kept, you know, they've got the topiaries, very colourful flower beds in summer. It does have the cascade, you know, one of those kind of like, it's a flight of steps with a fountain at the bottom, but it has like a pumping system where it has the water sort of flowing down on either side of the steps into the fountain. It's pretty good, you know, very well engineered and all that. But the thing about Holker Hall is, you know, apart from the gardens, apart from the house itself, there's also like an old coach house just off from the main mansion. And, bloody hell, fucking birds. I was about to say, that completely threw my train of thought entirely. I was going to say, this old coach house has been sort of converted, obviously now, into some amenities. They have like a little visitor centre in it. And apart from that, it also has a sort of cafe to it as well, where you can get your lunch, have a drink. So, you know, that's what we kind of did. Trolled up. We had a coffee, first and foremost, in the old coach house. Then we went for a good big wander right around the gardens, and, you know, by the time we'd basically done that, it was pretty much lunchtime. So then we stopped off in the coach house cafe again, and we had lunch. It was very nice. Had myself a plate of scampi and chips. It was delicious. Lovely stuff. Fortunately, the weather also was just right. Like, he had moments where it was nice and sunny, but particularly as we were sat down having lunch, there were moments where the sun just momentarily went behind the clouds, and it was just therefore nice and cool, nice breeze and all that. So Holker Hall was pretty damn good. Really, really enjoyed it overall. And apart from obviously the cafe and stuff, they also have a little other outbuilding with a gift shop in it. So you want to buy a little souvenir, you can do. I didn't actually buy any souvenirs myself, but yes, it's there, you know. Basically, it's tourist advice with red. If you're ever visiting the Lake District, go to Holker Hall. Lovely. I mean, if you're into that kind of thing, that is, you know, if you love wandering around old historic buildings like stately homes and their gardens and all that, then sure, give it a shot. So that was definitely one of the main things I did when I was back up north with the family. Other than that, you know, we just sort of did the usual kind of things that I like to do when I'm back visiting the north of England and all that. Go off to Lancaster, have a morning out, coffee at one of the tea shops in the centre of the city. If you're in Lancaster, visit Gallico Lounge. It's in the city centre, just down the road, not the road, just down the pedestrian street from the City Museum. Nice place. Get yourself an English breakfast muffin, or just technically a breakfast muffin as it's called. Toasted muffin. Well, actually you get two of them. A toasted muffin with sausages and cheese on it, and one with cheese and a fried egg on it. Drizzle it in some tomato ketchup and it is absolutely delicious. Again, tourist advice with red, if you're ever in the north of England. So yeah, we did Lancaster, we went up there, actually went up there twice. And then, what else did we do? Went up to Clitheroe again as usual, had lunch out at the Holmes Mill, the old Bowland Brewery, which is always a good place to go. And as always, whenever I go to Clitheroe, I always wander up to the castle on the hill. It's always pretty good. Again, I think have I ever shown video clips or photos that I've taken from Clitheroe Castle? I feel like I may have done. Possibly. Maybe someone could let me know in the comments. Have I ever done that in a Surrey Being Hunted episode? Have I ever taken videos or photos when I was at Clitheroe Castle and then actually had them in the video? Because I've talked about Clitheroe Castle before, haven't I? Sure I have. And I may have shown pictures of it at the time. Whoa. Jesus, wanged my camera up into the sky then as they started shooting. I was about to say as well, apart from obviously the castle in Clitheroe, there's also the Castle Museum, which I've not been in for years. I always keep saying to myself, next time I go back up north and we visit Clitheroe, I should go to the Castle Museum again. Actually, probably wander around it, but I never do. I always forget. I always forget to do so. Because it's been so many years. In fact, I think the only time I went to the Clitheroe Castle Museum was probably when I was a kid. So yeah, I don't really have very many memories of the place. They're kind of fuzzy. All the more reason why one day I need to get back there and actually explore it a bit more. So yes, Clitheroe, Lancaster, did those. The usual things I enjoy. Went down to a place called Barton Grange, which I'm pretty sure I've talked about before. Because that's always another favourite. I'm very much a creature of habit, you know, whenever I'm visiting back up north. There's certain things that I always like to do, whether that be visiting Lancaster, visiting Clitheroe, visiting Barton Grange. Yes, and again, for those of you who may have forgotten, because I'm pretty sure I've talked about it in Surrey 4, Surrey being hunted before even, Barton Grange is a garden centre near a small town in Lancashire called Billsborough. And basically it's, it's one of these kind of high-end, very fancy garden centres that also has like a farm shop, a food shop with, you know, very fancy food, local produce and stuff, a gift shop, a cookware shop, and then just across the way from it, there's this thing called the Flower Bowl, which is like a family entertainment centre where they have a curling rink and like a 2-screen cinema, as well as, you know, a couple of restaurants, like air hockey, mini golf, all kinds of stuff. It's always nice to visit. If you're ever in Lancashire, that area of the county, it's worth, you know, visiting. You know, you could say spend the morning at Barton Grange itself, having a look around the garden centre, coffee in the garden centre cafe. Once you've done that, nip across to the Flower Bowl and check it out. Maybe have lunch in one of its restaurants, something like that. You know, it's always a possibility, ladies and gentlemen. You see, this has been more tourism advice with Red. Red gives you an itinerary to do for the good portion of a morning if you're ever visiting that part of the country. So we did all that stuff. And like I say, I'll talk about the other lakes trip with Phil. Probably, you know, I would hope next episode if we, you know, me and him get an opportunity to record sometime soon. Probably on a weekend or something, I would imagine. That'll be the ideal time. And we'll talk about our trip to Windermere and the, you know, the Lakes Motor Museum and all that, and what sort of exhibits they had on there, because there's some good ones, you know. But without getting too far into that, other stuff just generally actually that I did have on my mind as I'm recording this. Think about the you know, the trip back down from the north of England, you know, when I'm driving down the M6, then obviously onto the M5. The thing about that trip is, I always find, without fail, you do encounter the odd, how should I say, dopey driver. And, you know, I set off quite early in the morning on the last Sunday the friggin' 17th, 18th, whatever day it was, in order to get back to my apartment. And, you know, obviously it's a long drive by UK standards, about 3 hours, which I know for all you Americans in the audience, that probably doesn't sound like much. You're like, oh, 3 hours, that's bloody nothing. Where I'm from, out in the old Midwest, you can drive for 16 hours and only get to the other side of the state. Never mind the country. Yes, well, look, when you're a geographically small country like the UK, 3 hours is a long time, alright? To go from the northwest of England right down to the, you know, what is technically the beginning of the southwest of England. And, yeah, so I was driving down the M6 onto the M5. It always strikes me how many dopey drivers you have. I don't know, what is that fucking bird doing then? It just despawned. Good lord. And the one thing that always kind of gets me is, you know, you're driving along, and it's early in the morning. You know, I set off at 7 in the morning in essence. Actually, not at 7, it's actually just before 7. It must have been like 10 to 7, 5 to 7 when I set off, something like that. So I got onto the M6, I'm driving down, tootling along at 60, 70, 80 miles an hour. And of course, like I say, at that time, usually the motorway is never that busy, because obviously it's still pretty early. So you only get a few other cars. The traffic's fairly light, and thus it's fairly easy to deal with. But of course, the thing obviously about UK motorways is that you always have to try and drive over on the left. Because typically most motorways in the UK will have 3 or 4 lanes on either side. And so, whichever side you're on, north or southbound, east or westbound, whatever, you always want to be, as often as you can, in the leftmost lane. And then the sort of, the rule is if you want to overtake, if you want to go faster, get past someone, you then have to, steer out right into one of the other lanes, so on and so forth. Now, of course, when it's early in the morning and there's not much traffic, you'd think most people would probably be over in the left-hand lane. Maybe a few in the middle lanes, just overtaking the people in the left. Typically, you wouldn't expect really to see anyone right out over on the rightmost lane of whichever side of the motorway you're progressing along. But you do see some people, and what sort of always gets me, and this is going to turn a little bit into a sort of, drivers I hate kind of rant, as I've done before sometimes in my Surrey Being Hunted series, and I've probably talked about this exact thing before, probably just repeating myself, but don't you just hate it when you're on a motorway, or a freeway, I think as you Americans would call it, and you are cruising along at a good speed, and you notice someone on your right, or whichever side it is, in other countries, if, you drive on a different side of the road and all that, but in the UK context, you see someone in the right-hand lane, and they're sort of pootling along, just cruising very steadily. They're not actually going that fast. And you, meanwhile, in one of the middle lanes, you're actually catching up to them, and you're thinking, that guy, that person, in that outside lane, outside? I always forget actually which was the outside and the inside lane on a UK motorway. I always get them confused. Whoever's in that right-hand lane, you think you need to get back over to the left. Seriously, there's no reason for you to be in that right-hand lane. You're not overtaking anybody. You need to get back over to the left. But for the longest time, that person in that rightmost lane just seems to cruise along very steadily. And of course, you in the middle are then sort of left with a bit of an awkward choice. You're thinking, well, should I just keep going at my present speed and potentially undertake them, which you're not really supposed to do in the UK? It's kind of an unspoken rule. I was actually having a conversation with this about Phil recently, and he was saying that there's not actually a specific law, as far as he's aware, that says you're not allowed to undertake someone on the motorway, but I'd say take that with a pinch of salt. Like, don't take legal advice from us. We're not lawyers. We're not experts on that. So, we could be wrong. I don't know. But even so, you're not supposed to undertake people because it's dangerous, right? Because the thing is, the lanes over to your right, they are the overtaking lanes. If you want to get past someone, you're supposed to do it in there. And the left-hand lane is for people who are just bombing along at slower speeds, or whatever. So, of course, if you undertake someone, there's always that danger of, as you're trying to pass them, if they haven't seen you, they might try and get back over to the left and collide with you, which is why you're not supposed to do it. That's why it's dangerous. And people sort of say, you don't do that. So, which of course is why it's awkward when you have someone right out in the rightmost overtake lane, for some reason bombing along, cruising along steadily, at not that fast a speed, when they should be getting back over to the left, and you're coming up towards them in one of the middle lanes, thinking, well, shoot, do I just have to kill my speed? And it gets me, these drivers spend so long doing that, just hanging around in that rightmost overtaking lane, and then suddenly it's like when you start approaching them, it's like they realise, oh shit, I'm not supposed to be in this lane. And they immediately start trying to get over. It's like, for fuck's sake, you've had all the time in the world to do that, you dopey beggar. Get a bloody move on. You know what the other one, actually, that gets me is, because I also had a couple of instances of this when I was driving back down south. Another one is when you're in the left lane, and you're starting to pick up a bit of speed, and you notice that obviously there's a vehicle ahead of you in the lane who's going slightly slower than you are, so you're technically catching up with them, meaning that you're probably going to need to, as you approach them, go out to the right into one of the middle lanes to overtake them. And as you get closer to this driver, you notice that they are themselves sat behind another vehicle, whether it's like a truck or something, that's, you know, only doing 60 or whatever, and they sit behind it, you know, for the longest time, as though, you know, they're just content to poodle along behind that vehicle. They're content to not try overtaking it. They're fine with the speed it's doing and all that. So you think, okay, right. So you start, you know, checking your mirrors. You start indicating with your right indicator, saying, I'm coming out into the next lane because I'm going to overtake. You come out into the next lane, and then as you're approaching them, suddenly the vehicle that you initially saw, which is just poodling along behind the slower truck or whatever, suddenly is like, oh yeah, I should get out and overtake as well. And it's like, for fuck's sake, you had all the time in the world to do that. It's like suddenly they decide they want to overtake as well as soon as they see you about to overtake them. It's like, are you dozy? Are you half asleep at the wheel? Please, get better at driving. Come on now. There has actually been a thing recently in the UK in some of the news about whether people above a certain age should not be allowed on the roads. Because the thing is, I think there was an accident on the roads recently that made the news here in the UK, where I think an elderly driver caused a absolute problem, and as a result there was a terrible accident that may have, I can't remember exactly what happened, I think someone may have died, but it ignited a bit of a debate about, you know, elderly drivers and whether people above a certain age should be on the road or not. And it's a bit of a complicated, thorny subject, I'll admit, because on the one hand, you sometimes wonder, is it necessarily age that's the problem, or is it, I don't know, because there are some, you know, old folks out there who, even at, you know, in their 80s or whatever, are still quite mentally sharp and do have decent reflexes and are therefore fine to drive. But obviously there's others who've maybe not kept those things particularly keen, particularly sharp. And as a result, you definitely look at them and you think you shouldn't be on the road and all that. You're not fit. And to be honest, I mean, my own inclination would be to say that that sort of decision on whether to withhold a driving licence from someone above a certain age, I feel like that should be done on a case-by-case basis. Because I know that, like, you know, when you get to a certain age here in the UK, you have to retake your driving test anyway, I think. I believe that is true. And of course it makes absolute sense why that would be a thing that, you know, you would have to do, just to check that, of course, you know, mentally your faculties are still there, your reflexes are still sharp enough to handle driving and all that. But yeah, I would say it has to be on a case-by-case basis and all, because I think it kind of taps in a bit to a sort of deeper question, really, societally, about, you know, the place of kind of very elderly people and how we treat them. Because the thing about, you know, as you get older in life, once you hit, obviously, you know, like your 70s and beyond, probably one of the things that you're really going to be worried about is your independence. Because, you know, you're probably going to be getting more and more aware that obviously your body is not what it once was. Even if, you know, you do regular exercise and you do keep yourself active, even with that, your body is not going to be as good as it was in your 30s. It's not even going to be what it was in your 40s, for example. And so, of course, like I say, once you start getting to that kind of age, 70s and 80s particularly, obviously, you do get increasingly just wary of certain potential health issues, that kind of thing. Like, for example, a lot of older people sometimes have problems with things like osteoporosis, which is obviously a bone problem, which can exacerbate other issues. For example, if someone with osteoporosis had a fall and broke a bone, that could potentially be really serious for them. So, of course, as you get older, you worry about your independence and your ability to just carry on life yourself and all that. And, that can be one of those things in life that I think for elderly people can be really, really difficult to deal with. Because it's not easy sometimes to accept that maybe, your body is not what it was, and that actually your life needs to adapt quite, significantly as a result of that. And so, when you obviously get to that age, and if you do find you're in a position where certain things in life are no longer easy anymore, you want to think about, how do I address that while still maintaining a degree of independence and flexibility in life? Because you want your elders to have dignified and enjoyable twilight decades in their life and all that. The last thing really you want, where possible, is for your elderly relative or whatever to end up being shoved away in a home, and that becomes the remainder of their life. You want them to still be able to live something that's a life that, is still fairly noteworthy and dignified. And the thing is, obviously, losing the ability to drive can be potentially something, I guess, psychologically speaking, quite downheartening, because obviously the thing about learning to drive is often you do it because you want to get a car. And obviously when you have a car, with that comes a degree of independence. You're not bound by the rules and vagaries of public transport or relying on other people. You have a car, you can fuel it, you can run it, you can pay the operating costs of it. And thus, if you want to go somewhere, you can just hop in the car, plan your route, and off you go. You can do it. So obviously, if you ever lose that ability to drive, especially because of medical reasons, anything like that, that can be downheartening, because it can feel like something which is a really important tool for your independence suddenly has been taken away from you. Your ability to just get into your car and go somewhere and do something interesting can feel like suddenly it's been really restricted. Obviously, I imagine that can be hard for a lot of older people to accept that. Which, of course, leads to that deeper conversation of how can you ensure that despite these things happening, your older relatives, the elderly people in your society, can still have, a life where they're still able to do interesting things, go and visit interesting places, where if they want to do something, their lack of ability to drive anymore doesn't impinge on them. And so that, I think, really kind of brings you to two things. I mean, on the one hand, public transport then always becomes extremely essential, and having, alternatives to car driving. Because things like here in the UK, for example, above a certain age, you qualify for things like a free bus pass, that kind of thing. And that's all well and good, but obviously you want the actual public transit system to be fairly good. You want there to be decent bus services that go to all kinds of places. So that if your elderly relative who could no longer drive wakes up one day thinking, I want to get out of the house, I want to go somewhere, I want to have a nice day out, I don't know, I want to go down to a local cafe or something, then having sufficient public transit just, puts them in a position where they can do that. And on top of that, I think, apart from public transit, you also want to make sure that your elderly relative, the elders in society, still have social circles. Because that's another thing that can very easily, I think, lead to sort of deterioration in the elderly when they have really no friends, no social circles anymore. That can be, I think, quite bad, particularly for sort of like, mental health and things like that. And you want, your elders to be able to go out and talk to people, make friends, visit new people, get new experiences, learn new things and all that. Because that's the thing you want, is for your elderly person to be basically just consigned to the home all day, sat in front of daytime TV 24/7. Because I think of my granddad on my father's side of the family, he died of Alzheimer's, and sometimes when we look at his lifestyle we think there could have been so much that he could have done in the run-up to his twilight years that probably actually would have helped him stave that off for longer. But he didn't really do that. He just had very specific routines that he would do. He would, for a while, he would wander down to town to the local library, but he would never go there for very long. He would always go down to the local library just to read a bunch of newspapers and then go home, and that'd be it. And then he'd just, I don't know, like sort of potter around the house for the remainder of the day, sit in front of TV and watch daytime TV shows, and that'd be it. And you just think to yourself, you're not really getting much stimulation out of that, are you? Are you? That's the thing, obviously, when you get older and older. There's lots of things you can do to sort of keep your mind active. One that my mother always swears by is actually just learning a few foreign language words a day and memorising them. When she says that, she doesn't mean like full on learning a new language. She just means like, learn, say, 4 or 5 French or Italian or Spanish words or whatever, and then for the rest of the day, every so often repeat them to yourself and memorise them, because it's good for your brain. It strengthens and creates new neural pathways and connections, which helps stave off, the slow deterioration of the brain and all that, which is what you want, ideally, because you don't want to be in a situation where, you're not really stimulating your brain as you get older, and as a result, rather than continually growing and developing new neural pathways, you don't want to be in that position where actually it's kind of the opposite, you're actually losing them. So yeah, that's something that my mother always swears by. And I think more generally, for elderly people, it's a matter as well of like finding things to do that are mentally rewarding and stimulating, which is probably, like I say, one of the reasons why my granddad, why Alzheimer's took hold of him in the way that it did. Because for the longest time, it's like, sometimes I think about my granddad on my dad's side of the family, and if you ever ask me what were your granddad's hobbies, what were things that he enjoyed doing, I'll be really brutally honest with you, I actually don't know. Other than wandering down to the library to read a bunch of newspapers, I actually can't remember anything that he was particularly into doing. Like some people, they enjoy things like writing or art, creative pursuits that are really good at just stimulating the brain and getting them thinking. Or, they have, say, like very social hobbies. They might go out to, I don't know, like a bridge or a chess club or something. Like, for example, one of my grandmothers, she occasionally does go and play things like card games and Scrabble and things like that with a bunch of friends. So she has that she does on occasion. And, like other old people who I know of, they go out like line dancing or whatever, which sounds, really twee. But, hey, it's a social link, right? It keeps them in touch with other people, and that helps keep the mind stimulated, keeps their social skills going, keeps their brain working and all that, and that's good for them. And I think really that's the kind of thing that, as you get older in particular, you really need to think about. Finding something that you enjoy doing that is mentally stimulating, keeps your mind engaged. So, like I say, that could be it could be all kinds of things. It could be a creative hobby. It could be a hobby that is very social, has a very distinct social aspect to it. It could be a hobby that is something that involves a lot of learning, like reading, for instance. Particularly reading things like, various more advanced forms of literature, classics, non-fiction books about history or about whatever topic interests you, that kind of thing. The thing is, you can challenge yourself as you're reading it, because sometimes you find with books, and I've found this myself sometimes because I enjoy reading a lot as well, but sometimes when you're reading, if you're reading for mental stimulation, you need to be quite strict with yourself. Because sometimes, you might pick up a book and start reading it, and it doesn't really engage you. You don't really dislike it, and you do keep reading it, but you find that it doesn't really engage you afterwards. Engage you during it, and afterwards, if you sort of look back on the book, say, in a couple of hours later, and ask yourself, that chapter that I read most recently, what actually happened during that? It's good to sort of challenge yourself in that sense and think to yourself, do I actually remember what I just read? Am I actually retaining any of that information? And that can be quite interesting. Because, of course, if you really engage with the book and you're really enjoying it, then the answer to that probably is yes. You can actually really remember a lot of information, retain a lot of the details of what happened in, like the most recent chapter that you read or whatever. But if obviously the book you're reading maybe isn't really engaging you, you might find that actually you don't really remember, or you just remember in very vague, broad strokes the overall outline of what happened, but the specific details you can't really just recall off the top of your head. And that can sometimes, I think, be a sign that, if you're reading for mental stimulation, you sort of might ask yourself, is that book really mentally stimulating me? Or do I need to find something else to read, perhaps? So, in that sense, you really have to think about what kind of things interest you, that kind of thing. I mean, most recently, for example, I've been reading a book in a series of volumes, British Library Tales of the Weird, and in particular, the book I've been reading is an instalment in this series. And it's about sort of short, creepy horror stories themed around railways. And the book that I read most recently, the story that I read most recently in that was by an author called R. Chetwynd Hayes or Haynes, something like that. And it was just called The Underground. And it was a really interesting story. It's basically kind of like a ghost story, but with a bit of a twist to it. And so, fuck it, I'm going to spoil the story and all that. Now, I never heard of R. Chetwynd Hayes before reading this story that he'd written, but it was actually quite a good one. I really enjoyed it. And basically, the protagonist is a middle-aged woman by the name of Lucy, and she lives in London, and every day she commutes on the London Underground into work and all that. And so R. Chetwynd Hayes, based on the little introduction that the editor of the book had written, I think was sort of writing sort of maybe mid-20th century. So probably about, I think, the 50s, roughly around there. Maybe 60s at the latest. And so he sort of tells you a lot about the protagonist Lucy's life, and how as a middle-aged woman living in this context of 50s or 60s or whenever it's set, obviously, there's still a lot of expectations around gender roles, and that she as a woman, of course, a lot of people around her kind of expect that, she will get married and eventually stop working and all that. She'll get a husband. So there's two other characters in particular in the story. There's her father, who is this basically old retired World War II veteran, who is very much, very traditionalist, very conservative sort of guy, and he's very much pushing her, you need to get married and become, focused on the home and all that. And then there's the guy who he's sort of pushing her to get into a relationship with, who is basically this sort of balding, very dull office worker kind of guy who is not a bad person, but is just kind of repellent in certain ways. Definitely not a catch, to put it that way, and all that. But as she's sort of commuting to work one day, the character basically sees a ghost on the tube of a young man in a Second World War British Army uniform, and she's like, huh, who the hell is that guy? And increasingly she starts to realise that he's a ghost, something like that. But it gets interesting as the story progresses, because at first she's the only person who can see this guy, but then, by chance, she runs into some other guy, a random dude, on the tube, who notices that she has noticed this ghost, and he basically says to her, oh, you can see him too, right? And it turns out that, so not everyone can see these ghosts, but that she can. And so she wonders, who is this ghost of what appears to be a young soldier from World War II? Who is he? But then as the story sort of progresses, it goes in a very interesting direction. So you think, it's going to, in stereotypical fashion, it's going to be like the ghost of, I don't know, someone who lived in London who was sent off to fight and died on the battlefield or something. So you think that's where maybe it would go, but it doesn't. And the sort of twist at the end is that this ghost is not actually the ghost of a dead person. This is where it gets really weird and interesting. This ghost is actually sort of like a weird residual spiritual memory of something that happened in that tube station a number of years ago. Like it's a memory that's been left there of something grisly that happened. And basically the twist is that this suitor, who the protagonist's father is very much pushing her to get into a relationship with, in one of the conversations he sort of talks about her mother. And so the story is that her mother basically had an affair and ran away with another man, and then had an accident on the tube and died. But something that this suitor says to the protagonist suddenly gets her thinking, and she suddenly puts these little disparate pieces of information together and realises something. And fuck it, I'm going to spoil the end of the story, because why the hell not? Because I love it. It was a great story. Thought it was really engaging. The twist basically is that she realises her mother did not die in an accident. She was pushed in front of a tube train. And the ghost of the soldier, that's not just some random soldier. That is an image of her father's younger self during the Second World War, when she was just a baby, or just a small child. And so basically what she, thought was a ghost isn't like a ghost of a dead person. It's the ghost, sort of like a lingering trace of something grisly that happened in years gone by. And of course she then confronts her father about it, and there's this really satisfying scene where she basically just gives him absolute fucking she absolutely serves him with the truth of what happened, quite bluntly. It was a great story, really, really good. A little bit of humour to it as well. And like I say, that's a story that really engaged me, and so it really sticks out in my mind. It's one of those examples of, if you find a story, a book or whatever, that really engages you, you should be able to remember details of it, even hours, days after you've read it. So yeah, it was a good one. But there's some other railway-themed sort of tales of the macabre and tales of supernatural horror from that book that I do remember. Not as much as that one. There was one actually, I forget the author and the title of it, but there's one in the book that's actually set in America, and it's basically a dude who works like I don't think it's like a telegram office on like a remote railway line, who basically, I think, sees a ghost or something who warns him that something bad is going to happen that night, and then lo and behold, at night, something bad does happen. He's awake in his little office and someone tries to rob it. Little stories like that, basically. But that British Library Tales of the Weird franchise of books, of which this railway one is just one instalment. I've read one other in that series, which was Strange Tales from the Deep, which is about basically horror and macabre stories, but with obviously a maritime flavour to them. And there were some good ones in that one. There was a good one, again, I forget the author and the title of the story, but there was a good one in that one that I do recall, because it stands out in my memory a lot. In fact, there's a couple of good ones. There was one where it was about a couple of Danish officers on a merchant ship just after the First World War who are serving alongside a German officer who they discover was a former U-boat captain. And then, as they're sailing along, I think through, I can't remember if it's the North Sea or the Atlantic, but I remember the sort of general gist of what happened. Basically, they start hearing a weird tapping noise, and then suddenly they realise that it's tapping in Morse code, and they discover that they're literally sailing over, I think, the site of a ship that was sunk in World War One by this German officer's very U-boat, and so it's basically the ghosts in the shipwreck communicating and relaying the truth of what happened to them, which is quite an interesting concept. The other story that I actually really remember from that book, I think it was the first one. Again, I forget the bloody name of the author and the title of it, but I remember the details of the story in terms of how it played out. Basically, it was sort of like a bunch of sailors are sailing across whatever ocean it is, the Atlantic or whatever, when they come across a ship adrift with nobody aboard it. So it's a bit kind of like a Marie Celeste situation. So they bring themselves alongside this ship, they go aboard it, and they can find absolutely no trace of this ship's crew or anything. But the one thing they do find, hanging in a cage, is a parrot. And the parrot seems to be sort of almost lifeless, and it's exhausted and dehydrated. So they feed it and give it a bit of water and sort of like coach it back to wakefulness. And then that's where things get interesting, because suddenly the parrot starts to like scream, like not even in like a sort of the usual sort of adorable cutesy way that parrots do, but like full on horrible sounds that it's making. And so the people who've boarded the ship to try and investigate what's going on are like, what the fuck? What is going on with that parrot? Why is it being like that? And of course, as you can probably see where this story's going, the twist is that, of course, parrots are obviously able to imitate human speech. And so as it starts to screech and scream, the parrot then starts saying things that are like really freaky and weird. And they realise, this crew who've boarded it to investigate realise that what they're hearing are the final few words spoken by the crew of this ship that's adrift before they disappeared. And which I think is a really good concept, really creepy. And so basically like the thing that the parrot says is something like, basically gives the hint that something weird happened on the ship. They encountered some kind of strange entity or monster or something. And of course the story I think ends with the crew who've boarded the ship to investigate being so fucking creeped out and freaking out from what they're hearing that they basically just put the parrot out of its misery and then take the ship in for salvage. So yeah, that was actually a really creative story. Like I say, I forget the name of the story or the author, but it's one of those ones which has a really interesting concept to it, which I think is really good. So yeah, I've been on Amazon recently wishlisting a load of these British Library Tales of the Weird books, putting them onto my shopping list on Amazon. Because there's loads of like these books, all with different themes. So I bought another one from Waterstones back up north recently, which is I think like Tales of Old Gods or The Return of Old Gods or something, which I think is all about sort of horror about kind of like pre-Christian sort of pagan tales, that kind of thing, in England. So that's the thing. A lot of the stories in these books are by British authors. Most, not all of them. Some of them are by American authors, for example. But obviously, as a result, a lot of them have a UK sort of focus, UK settings. So I want to read this one that I bought from Waterstones in Lancaster recently. All about sort of the return of old gods and all that. But other ones that I've wishlisted on Amazon, there's ones about like tales of polar horror at the ice caps, for example, which sounds pretty good. Probably chimes right in with my love of maritime stuff. So there's that. There's other stuff about sort of things like household horror, that kind of thing. So there's lots of different themes, basically. Gosh, that makes me think though my shopping list on Amazon must be huge, because I've wishlisted so many books recently on it. Books, manga, all kinds of stuff that I want to read because it looks interesting. So I'll have to get around to that at some point and have a little looky-loo. Actually buy some of it and all that. Yours. Let me know in the comments though, ladies and gentlemen. Is there anything you've been reading recently that you think's been really interesting? And that I might be therefore interested in reading? My reading taste can be quite eclectic. Like I say, sometimes I like reading manga, sometimes I like reading a bit of horror. Actually, I've also bought a Stephen King anthology recently, Skeleton Crew, which has a few sort of shorter stories of his in it. So I want to read that as well, because, you know, I do enjoy a good Stephen King novel. I know sometimes he can be a bit of a pulpy writer, but sometimes he has some really good stories. I've talked before about how some of my favourite Stephen King stories are actually not his most famous works. I mean, you know, everyone obviously talks about Stephen King. They talk about The Shining, Carrie, Doctor Sleep, and they're good stories, don't get me wrong, I've read them. But a couple of ones that I sometimes do find myself really enjoying are some of his lesser known ones, or the ones that are not as sort of big as those books, like Doom a Key or From a Buick 8. Those are good ones. I think I've said before how From a Buick 8, that's a Stephen King novel that every once in a while I always find myself revisiting and rereading it again. I don't know, it's just the way it flows and just the general subject matter of it, just really, I love it. It's really, really cool. I really enjoy it. But yes, that's my Stephen King recommendation, ladies and gentlemen, From a Buick 8. A Stephen King book that I've never actually read, I probably should do, is Christine, which I think is the one about a guy who buys a car that is possessed, and the car becomes obsessed with him. Should probably get that at some point, read that one. And another author who I need to get some more horror stories of at some point is Junji Ito, because I've read a few of his. The Enigma of Amigara Fault, who's a marquee, Gyo, but he's got loads. And you can get anthologies of a lot of his shorter horror mangas, like Shiva and Soichi, that kind of thing. So I really should buy some more of them. Should add them to my Amazon shopping list. Get them at some point. But yes, looking at time, I think we'll probably start to wrap up fairly soon, as soon as I can get back to the Standing Stones. Actually, I've just been wandering around a bit aimlessly, haven't I, so far? Does anybody have any food in these doors for me? That is a lot of weed killer. There's cat food in there, but is there anything better than that? So I can avoid having to eat my canned pie. Not really. Curious. Right, well, eat the canned pie then. Need to find a fireplace so I can actually roast up this rabbit that I've got in my inventory. But we're not going to be doing that this episode, ladies and gentlemen. Okay, well, while I'm heading back towards these Standing Stones, I guess I'll wrap up here. It is now 1 o'clock in the afternoon, and that means it's lunchtime. I'm getting hungry. Also, my washing machine was on a cycle and it's now done, so I need to go and empty it, put my towels out to air out and all that. So here we are, ladies and gentlemen. In that case, thank you for joining me, and I hope you enjoyed this, long podcast style episode with just myself on this occasion. Like I say, I think for the next one I'll try and get Phil involved at the very least, so that way we can talk about maybe our Lake District visit while I was visiting back up north. We can talk about the Lakeland Motor Museum, because there's probably plenty to talk about around that. So join me for that then, ladies and gentlemen, assuming of course that that is the one that I get an opportunity to record next. And I'll see you, soon for more content on the channel. Do obviously, stick around with, obviously, If My Heart Had Wings. I know that as a visual novel, the views on that have kind of slackened off a bit over time, but I'm enjoying it. And, a couple of other people on the channel, I think, are enjoying it as well. It still gets the odd comment, the odd like from time to time, even though the views have slackened off on it. So, check it out and all that. Facebook Twitter links, as usual, are down below. Along with links to my propagandist channel if you're interested, blah, blah, blah. If you enjoyed, a like is, of course, always appreciated. But other than that, I'll see you next time. Goodbye, everybody. Do we want to... See, part of me is wondering if there's a reason why there's bands of Shreks over here. Are we going to need them to take out I don't know, like a tank or something, but would they drive a tank in here? That is the question. And where would the vehicles even come in from? Down there, maybe? Or is there a gate like down there, out the other side of the fort? Ah, fuck it. We're going to have some fun with this Panzer Shrek, ladies and gentlemen. 1. D8. 2. Hit. I'm getting XP for it at least. 3.